Most people think they lose focus because life has become too busy. Too many messages, too many tasks, too many demands pulling at the mind from every direction. But that is usually not where the damage begins. The damage begins earlier, in smaller places, in moments that barely seem worth noticing. A glance that was supposed to last a second. A thought that did not need to be followed. A mood that quietly changes the meaning of the morning. And by the time a person finally sits down to do what matters, something inside already feels spent. The mind is present, but not fully. The body is there, but attention has already been scattered into a dozen invisible directions. That is why the Stoic view of focus is more serious than modern advice about productivity. It does not begin with hacks, it begins with government. What rules the mind? What enters it? What is allowed to stay? What gets believed too quickly? What gets treated as important before it has earned that status? Because a distracted life is rarely destroyed by one dramatic event. More often, it is eroded by many small permissions. The first rule is to guard your mind before you guard your time. Most people try to protect the day at the level of the schedule. They block hours, they make plans, they organize priorities, and none of that is useless. But it is incomplete, because attention is often lost before the hour even begins. It is lost in what enters first, in what colors the morning, in what claims the mind before any serious effort has started. A piece of noise, a random scroll, a quiet comparison. A low-grade irritation, something trivial but not harmless. Marcus Aurelius kept returning to a simple truth. The soul is dyed by the color of its thoughts. The wording matters because it reminds you that attention is not neutral. What you repeatedly allow into the mind does not merely pass through. It leaves residue. It shapes the emotional climate in which the rest of the day unfolds. So before the world takes your time, it usually takes something even more important. It takes the quality of your presence. This is why a person can have a well-planned day and still feel inwardly weak. The structure may be sound, but the entry points were left unguarded. The mind was treated like a public place. Everything could enter. Everything could make a claim. Everything could leave a trace. Then later comes the confusion. Why does simple work feel heavy? Why does concentration now feel forced? Why does the day already seem fractured before anything difficult has even happened? Because focus is not built only by deciding what to do. It is built by deciding what gets access to you. What deserves your first thought? What deserves your first emotional response? What deserves to set the tone of the day? The Stoics understood this deeply because they never separated inner order from outer action. If the inner gate is weak, the rest of life becomes harder than it needs to be. Not because the world became impossible, but because too much was admitted before anything meaningful had begun. And once that becomes clear, the second rule begins to matter. Stop treating every thought like it matters. This is where many people lose far more attention than they realize. They assume distraction is mainly external. Other people, phones, noise, deadlines. But often the stronger source is internal. A thought appears, and immediately it is treated like a signal that deserves engagement. A fear, a memory, a doubt, a fantasy, a sentence someone said 3 days ago. A small insecurity that suddenly wants a courtroom, a defense, and a full emotional trial. The mistake is subtle. It is the habit of confusing appearance with authority. Epictetus built much of his thought around this problem. What appears to the mind is not yet the same thing as what should be believed. But most people do not live that way. They live as though every mental event arrives with a claim on their obedience. The mind produces movement, and they treat movement as meaning. It produces emotional charge, and they assume the charge proves importance. It produces urgency, and they surrender before asking whether anything real is being asked of them at all. This is one of the hidden reasons focus feels so fragile. It is not only that the world interrupts us, it is that we keep kneeling to whatever arises within. A person sits down to work, and the mind offers detours. Check this first. Revisit that awkward moment. Think about what they meant. Imagine the worst outcome. Start planning a different future. Defend yourself in an argument that is not happening. Fix your entire life before lunch. And because each thought arrives with a certain force, it gets treated like an instruction. But a thought can be loud and still be worthless. It can feel urgent and still deserve no response. It can be emotionally charged and still have nothing to do with what truly matters. This is not suppression. It is discernment. It is the slow building of an inner posture in which the mind is no longer obeyed merely because it is active. A focused person is not someone who has achieved perfect silence. That image only creates disappointment. A focused person is someone who has weakened the automatic authority of mental noise. They notice faster. They believe less blindly. They do not walk into every room the mind opens for them. And that changes the whole texture of work, thought, and daily life. Because the problem is no longer, how do I stop thoughts from appearing? The problem becomes, why should every appearance become direction? Once that question becomes real, a third one begins to press more honestly. If not everything deserves attention, then what does? That is the third rule. Decide what actually matters. Many people say they want focus, but they have never made a clean decision about what deserves their loyalty. So the mind remains available to whatever is louder, newer, easier, or more emotionally stimulating. 1 hour belongs to ambition, the next to distraction, the next to anxiety, the next to comparison, the next to half-formed goals that never become commitments. Then they call this an attention problem. But often it is first a clarity problem. A mind that has not chosen clearly will always be vulnerable, not because it is weak in some dramatic sense, but because vagueness creates openness, and openness invites invasion. If you have not decided what matters, the irrelevant will keep presenting itself as urgent. If you have not named what deserves your effort, your attention will be recruited by what merely knows how to shout. This is why serious focus is not only a discipline of resistance, it is a discipline of selection. Seneca warned that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And there is something painfully modern in that line, because so many people now live in fragments. A little energy goes here, a little there, a little into fear, a little into image, a little into work, a little into escape. Nothing is chosen with enough seriousness to gather the self into one direction. So the question becomes harder and better. What actually matters in this season of your life? Not what sounds impressive, not what flatters your self-image, not what you like to imagine caring about. What truly deserves your mind now? What responsibility? What work? What discipline? What burden worth carrying? What slow task that may not reward you today, but will shape you if you remain faithful to it? Because once that becomes clearer, attention changes with it. Decision reduces friction. Purpose weakens temptation. A chosen direction makes refusal more natural. And only then does the deeper challenge come into view. Because even when a person knows what matters, even when they begin guarding the gate more carefully, attention can still be stolen in another way. Not by confusion this time, but by seduction. By what is trivial, tempting, emotionally charged, and skilled at making itself feel more deserving than it really is. That is where stronger refusal has to begin. That is where the fourth rule begins. Train yourself to ignore what does not deserve you. This sounds simple until you look closely at how attention is actually lost. Most distractions do not arrive as obvious enemies. They do not announce themselves as destruction. They arrive dressed in forms that feel harmless, interesting, emotionally justified, or even momentarily rewarding. A small curiosity, a minor irritation, a conversation that pulls at the ego, a piece of information that flatters your appetite for novelty, something trivial but attractive enough to make refusal feel unreasonable. And that is exactly why this rule matters. If distraction always appeared as danger, people would resist it more easily. But much of what weakens attention comes in a more seductive form. It does not ask to ruin your life. It only asks for a minute. It only asks for a glance. It only asks for a little emotional energy. And because the cost seems small, the mind gives in, then gives in again, then again. And slowly, a person becomes loyal to interruption without ever consciously choosing it. The Stoic mind has to become more severe here, not harsh, not cold, but selective in a deeper way. Because one of the highest forms of self-respect is learning that not everything deserves your attendance. Not every message deserves your inward movement. Not every opinion deserves your reply. Not every curiosity deserves entry. Not every invitation deserves your mind. This is especially difficult now because modern life constantly trains people to feel that responsiveness is virtue, to answer quickly, to look immediately, to stay updated, to remain available, to prove relevance by never fully withdrawing attention from the stream. But there is a hidden humiliation in living this way. Your inner life becomes trainable by whatever knows how to knock hard enough. Your focus stops belonging to you. It belongs to whatever interrupts most effectively. So this rule is not only about distraction, it is about dignity, about whether your attention is cheap or governed, about whether the world can recruit you with every little stimulus, or whether there is something within you that says, no, this does not deserve me. Not because it is evil, not because it is dramatic, simply because it is not worthy of the cost. And that cost is larger than people admit. Every unnecessary engagement leaves a residue, a thought loop, a shift in mood, a broken rhythm, a small internal agitation that follows you into the next task. By itself, it looks insignificant. But attention is shaped by accumulation. A life does not become shallow because of one major surrender. It becomes shallow through repeated minor leaks. So the stronger question is not only what distracts you, it is what keeps getting access to you without having earned it. What keeps inviting your mind into small, unimportant loyalties? What keeps making itself feel like it matters when in truth it only consumes? Because focus is not only concentration, it is the disciplined refusal to cooperate with the irrelevant. But even when that becomes clear, attention can still be stolen in another way, not by what is trivial, but by what feels personal. And that brings us to the fifth rule: do not let emotion hijack your direction. This is where many serious people quietly lose whole days, not because they are lazy, not because they lack goals, but because a single emotional event takes command of their attention and alters the direction of everything that follows. A message arrives with the wrong tone. Someone disappoints you. Something triggers insecurity. An old frustration gets touched. Suddenly, the day is no longer governed by intention, it is governed by reaction. This is one of the most underestimated enemies of focus. People think concentration is mainly threatened by entertainment, noise, and external interruptions. But emotion can be even more disruptive, because when feeling takes over, distraction no longer feels like distraction. It feels justified. It feels necessary. It feels as though attention should now revolve around the wound, the irritation, the imagined meaning of what happened. A person can lose hours this way without leaving their chair. They continue sitting there, but inwardly they are in another world, replaying a sentence, interpreting a look, defending themselves in silence, imagining outcomes, feeding an emotional current that began as a moment and then became a whole climate. By the end of the day, they say they had no focus, but often what they really lacked was emotional command. The Stoics understood this without pretending people should become numb. They did not ask you to feel nothing. They asked you not to become ruled by what you feel first. There is a great difference between having an emotion and handing it authority. The first is human. The second is surrender. This is why emotional discipline protects attention so powerfully, not because it makes you less alive, but because it prevents temporary weather from rewriting permanent direction. A bad mood should not decide what matters. An irritation should not become a new philosophy. A disappointment should not get to seize the whole field of awareness. Yet this happens constantly when the inner world has not been trained to pause before obeying. And that pause matters more than most people realize. In that pause, the day can still be saved. In that pause, what happened is still just an event, not yet an empire. In that pause, you can refuse to let passing emotion become lasting direction. You can feel without entering servitude to feeling. This is not easy because emotional reactions often come wrapped in identity. They whisper that if you do not follow them, you are suppressing yourself, betraying yourself, ignoring something important. But often you are doing something far wiser. You are protecting the day from being organized around a passing disturbance. You are refusing to let an inner spike become the center of gravity. You are choosing direction over drift. And yet even with refusal, even with emotional steadiness, another mistake remains. Many people still imagine focus as something that is either present or lost, perfect or broken. They drift once and mentally surrender the whole day. Which is why the sixth rule matters so much. Learn the power of returning quickly. This may be one of the hidden disciplines behind all serious concentration. Not never drifting, not never losing rhythm, not never getting pulled away, but returning sooner, with less drama, and without turning one lapse into an identity. Because the truth is, attention will wander. You will have moments of weakness. Your mind will slip. Your energy will dip. Something will pull you for a while. The question is not whether that happens. The question is how long you remain away. Many people are not defeated by distraction itself. They are defeated by what happens after distraction. They notice they slipped, then begin judging the slip. They feel disappointed, then feed the disappointment. They lose 20 minutes, then turn it into 3 wasted hours because they cannot return cleanly. A small break in focus becomes a full collapse because the mind adds self-accusation, frustration, and hopelessness to the original mistake. But strong attention is not built on perfectionism. It is built on recovery, the ability to come back without theatrical self-punishment, the ability to say, "I left, now I return." Nothing more, no speech, no self-condemnation, no decision that the day is ruined. Just return. There is real dignity in this, because return is a form of power. It means you are not completely governed by momentum, mood, or error. It means a bad hour does not get to own the rest of the day. It means attention is becoming sturdier, not because it never bends, but because it bends less catastrophically. And in practice, this changes everything. The person with weak recovery is always living inside overreaction. One interruption becomes a spiral. One mistake becomes self-distrust. One lost stretch of time becomes permission to abandon the whole effort. But the person who returns quickly preserves something essential: continuity. They understand that discipline is not a flawless line. It is a repeated restoration of direction. This is also where the episode begins to move into a more difficult modern problem, because sometimes attention is not lost through thought, triviality, or emotion alone. Sometimes it is weakened more gradually by the way the mind has been trained to crave stimulation itself, by the need for fresh input, by the shrinking ability to remain with one thing long enough for depth to begin. And once that appetite is strengthened, even returning becomes harder than it should be. That is where the seventh rule becomes unavoidable. Stop feeding your mind constant novelty. A mind that is always reaching for something new becomes quietly incapable of staying with anything long enough to be changed by it. This is one of the strange habits of modern distraction. People often think the danger lies only in wasting time, but the deeper problem is that constant novelty reshapes the nervous system itself. It trains attention to expect freshness, movement, and reward at short intervals. Then, when real work asks for patience, repetition, difficulty, or silence, the mind feels almost insulted by the request. This is why depth has become harder for so many people, not because they are incapable of seriousness, but because they have been conditioned into restlessness. A little stimulation here, a quick switch there, a steady diet of new inputs, each one tiny, each one seemingly harmless, yet together building a mind that struggles to stay with anything that does not immediately sparkle. And once that becomes a habit, even meaningful effort begins to feel dull simply because it does not keep offering novelty fast enough. The Stoics would have recognized the danger, even if the forms have changed. A person who lives at the mercy of appetite becomes less free, even when the appetite looks innocent. It does not matter whether the craving is for luxury, praise, entertainment, or endless stimulation. The mechanism is similar. The self becomes harder to govern because it keeps needing the world to provide another hit of interest before it can remain still. And the tragedy is that novelty does not only steal time, it weakens intimacy with what matters. Work begins to feel flatter than it really is. Silence begins to feel emptier than it really is. Reading, reflection, and long effort begin to feel harder than they truly are, because the mind has been trained to compare them against a stream of constant interruption and instant reward. So attention becomes shallow, not only because the person is distracted, but because they no longer know how to dwell. This is why serious focus requires a certain kind of fasting, not necessarily from all stimulation, but from unnecessary stimulation, from the compulsion to refresh the mind every few minutes with something new, from the belief that boredom is a problem that must be solved immediately. Because often the threshold between shallowness and depth is crossed only after a person survives the first wave of restlessness instead of obeying it. You see this in simple moments. You begin something important, and after a short while the mind starts asking for flavor, something else, something easier, something brighter, something that changes the temperature. And if you obey that request every time, you keep teaching the mind that it never has to remain anywhere long enough to mature. But if you stay, if you bear the plainness, if you remain through the early dryness instead of escaping it, something stronger begins to grow, not excitement, stamina, the ability to stay. And once that truth becomes visible, another practical question follows almost immediately. If the mind is so easily shaped by what enters early and repeatedly, then the opening of the day matters far more than most people admit. That is where the 8th rule begins. Protect the first hours of your day. The first hours are rarely neutral. They are often formative. They establish not only the schedule of the day, but its inner texture. A fractured morning tends to produce a fractured mind. A reactive opening often leads to a reactive day. This is why so many people feel as though they are catching up to themselves from the moment they wake up. They begin the morning already mentally recruited by noise, by urgency, by outside inputs, by emotional residue they have not yet had time to examine. And once that happens, the day no longer develops from within. It begins from invasion. The mind is pulled outward before it has had any chance to gather itself. So instead of meeting the day with direction, the person enters it in fragments. Half awake, half reactive, already available to whatever asks first. Then later they try to recover focus, but the foundation was never laid cleanly. This is why protecting the first hours is not about building a perfect morning routine to admire. It is about preserving the mind before the world starts making claims on it, before comparison enters, before urgency enters, before stimulation starts telling you what reality is supposed to feel like. In a deeper sense, the first hours are where self-command either begins to gather or begins to leak. That does not mean the morning must become rigid, aesthetic, or ceremonial. It means it should not be surrendered carelessly. The point is not to perform discipline. The point is to create enough inward order that the day begins from your center rather than from other people's demands. Even a simple difference matters. A slower entry, less noise, fewer random inputs, some silence before reaction, some thought before exposure. These things look small from the outside, but they decide a great deal about the quality of attention that follows. Because once the day has been emotionally colonized early, everything afterward becomes heavier. Work feels more fractured, irritation rises faster, temptation feels stronger. The mind keeps reaching outward, because outwardness has already become its posture. So the first hours matter not because they are magical, but because they are vulnerable. What enters there often echoes for much longer than people think. And when the day has already been broken in this way, many people make the problem worse through another habit that looks productive on the surface. They begin more and more, hoping movement itself will rescue them. But that only leads us to the 9th rule: finish more, start less. There is a kind of restless activity that feels like seriousness, but is really a disguised form of fragmentation. A person keeps beginning things, new tasks, new plans, new tabs, new intentions, new systems. And because there is movement, they assume there is progress. But much of the time what they are actually creating is a field of open loops, each one making a claim on attention, each one draining a little more mental energy simply by remaining unfinished. Unfinished things have weight. Even when they are not in front of you, they stay somewhere in the mind. They generate background tension. They divide commitment. They make it harder to bring full presence to the thing that is currently in your hands, because part of the self is still leaking into what was started and not completed. This is one of the quieter reasons modern people feel mentally crowded. Not because they have one great burden, but because they carry too many unresolved beginnings. And there is vanity in this too. Starting often feels more exciting than finishing. Beginnings flatter the imagination. They let you feel possibility without yet submitting to the discipline that completion demands. Finishing is different. Finishing asks for endurance when the glow is gone. It asks for loyalty after novelty has faded. It asks for contact with limits, boredom, repetition, imperfection. And this is why many people keep beginning. It lets them feel active without having to pay the full price of devotion. But a stronger mind learns to respect completion, not as a mechanical obsession, but as a stabilizing force. Every finished thing gathers the self. Every completed effort strengthens trust in your own direction. Every time you remain with something long enough to bring it across the line, attention becomes less scattered. The mind stops living in so many pending worlds. This does not mean a person should never explore, never change course, never begin new things. It means beginning should become more sacred, more deliberate, less casual. A start should mean more than a mood. Otherwise, attention becomes a servant of impulse, always opening new doors, rarely staying long enough in one room to build anything solid. And once you begin to see the cost of endless beginnings, another distinction becomes necessary. Because sometimes the problem is not that a person starts too much, but that they keep giving their life to what screams first, instead of what matters most. And that confusion between the important and the immediate is where attention is often stolen most successfully. That is where the 10th rule becomes essential. Separate the important from the immediate. This is one of the hardest disciplines in a noisy life, because the immediate almost always knows how to feel more convincing than the important. It arrives with volume. It arrives with motion. It arrives with the emotional pressure of now. A message, a request, a problem, a small urgency that presents itself as if the whole order of the day should now rearrange around it. And because it is close, because it is visible, because it feels active, it gains power that it has not truly earned. The important is rarely this loud. What matters most often speaks in a quieter register. It asks for steady effort, not quick reaction. It does not always flatter the ego. It does not always come wrapped in urgency. Sometimes it waits in the background, patient but costly, while the immediate keeps throwing sparks in front of the mind. And if a person has not trained this distinction carefully, life starts getting governed by whatever interrupts first, rather than by what actually deserves loyalty. This is one of the reasons so many people end their days tired but strangely dissatisfied. They were not inactive, they were busy, they answered things, they handled things, they moved from one small demand to another. Yet, somewhere underneath the activity, something more essential was neglected. Not because it was impossible, but because it did not know how to shout. So attention was spent, but not invested. Energy was consumed, but not directed. The Stoic mind has to become wiser than this. It has to learn that urgency is not the same thing as importance. Proximity is not the same thing as value. Emotional pressure is not the same thing as rightful claim. Otherwise, the whole day becomes a sequence of reactions, and the deeper architecture of life begins to erode. Because the important things are often built slowly. Character, work of substance, inner reform, long responsibilities. They do not survive well in a mind that keeps kneeling to what is loudest. So this rule is not only about prioritization in the modern sense, it is about loyalty, about deciding that your life will not be handed over to the nearest demand simply because it arrived with intensity. The question is not only what needs attention now. The harder question is what deserves attention most. And the more honestly you ask that, the more uncomfortable certain habits become. Because you begin to see how much of your energy has been stolen by things that were merely immediate, not meaningful. And once that begins to clear, another leak in attention becomes harder to ignore. Not the pressure of tasks this time, but the pressure of other people's visible lives. That is where the 11th rule enters. Stop looking at other people's lives. This is not a moral slogan against curiosity. It is a recognition of how easily attention loses its center when it keeps leaving its own path. Comparison is often treated as an emotional issue, and it is that. But it is also a concentration issue. Because every unnecessary glance into someone else's pace, image, success, beauty, status, or progress pulls part of the self away from its own work. And what begins as a moment of looking can quickly become a whole inner relocation. The damage here is subtle. You may not even feel dramatic envy. Sometimes it is quieter than that. A shift in mood, a loss of conviction, a sudden doubt about your own timing, a faint restlessness that was not there before, a feeling that your path has become less meaningful simply because someone else's path became more visible. This is one of the humiliations of comparison. It can weaken you without ever fully announcing itself. And what makes it so costly is that it rarely gives anything back equal to what it takes. It steals steadiness. It steals intimacy with your own season. It steals the psychological continuity needed for deep work, because part of the mind is now rehearsing someone else's life instead of inhabiting its own. You begin the day with your own direction. Then, an hour later, your attention is wandering through people you do not know. Rhythms that are not yours. Milestones that have nothing to do with the work actually in front of you. And then you wonder why your own life feels distant. The Stoics were severe on this in their own way, not because they wanted people to become indifferent to humanity, but because they understood that a person who is always measuring outward becomes unstable inwardly. You cannot build a life with serious concentration while constantly checking whether your existence still looks acceptable beside someone else's. The mind becomes split. One part is trying to live. Another part is trying to witness itself from the outside and ask whether it compares well. That is why this rule has to become practical, not merely philosophical. Stop giving your attention away to images that weaken your own path. Stop entering other people's pace so often that you lose trust in your own. Stop letting visibility become authority. A life does not become stronger by constantly observing what it is not. It becomes stronger by returning again and again to the demands of what it actually is. And once you see how much attention is drained by that outward movement, a deeper truth begins to show itself. Sometimes distraction is not mainly caused by the world at all. Sometimes the real noise comes from inside, from conflict within the self. That is where the 12th rule matters. Build a life with fewer internal arguments. Many people think they're distracted because life is demanding, technology is invasive, or the culture is overstimulating. All of that may be true, but sometimes the greater exhaustion comes from inner division. One part of the self wants discipline. Another wants escape. One wants meaning. Another wants comfort. One wants to become stronger, another wants to remain unchallenged. And because these loyalties are never settled honestly, attention keeps getting consumed in invisible negotiation. This kind of conflict is especially draining because it follows you everywhere. You can leave a room, you can turn off a device, you can decline an invitation, but you cannot outrun a divided self. When the inner world is full of unresolved contradiction, focus becomes heavy before the work even begins. Every meaningful effort has to drag a second self behind it, a quieter resistance that questions, delays, bargains, or looks for relief. So what appears on the surface as distraction is often deeper than that. It is civil war within the will. And this is why simplification matters so much. Not simplification of life into something empty, but simplification of allegiance. Fewer inner contradictions, fewer secret negotiations, fewer habits that openly serve one set of values while privately feeding another. Because the mind becomes stronger when it is less divided against itself. Attention flows more cleanly when there are fewer internal voices, each demanding a different future. This does not happen through slogans. It happens through honesty, through seeing where your life is still built on compromise with what weakens you, through noticing where you keep asking clarity from the mind while preserving confusion in conduct, through realizing that some forms of distraction are not accidents at all. They are escapes you continue to protect. And once that truth lands, the episode has to slow down a little, because at this point, the problem is no longer just external noise or even internal conflict. The mind itself has been strained by too much input, too much reaction, too much divided energy, which means the next movement is not only about resistance, it is about recovery, about what the mind needs if it is to become clear again, instead of merely controlled. That is where the 13th rule begins. Make silence a daily discipline. Not silence as performance, not silence as a dramatic escape from the world, and not silence as something spiritual in a vague or decorative sense. What matters here is simpler and more serious. The mind needs intervals in which nothing new is constantly entering it. No fresh stimulation, no endless reaction, no immediate demand to answer, interpret, compare, or decide. Without that, attention may be controlled for a while, but it rarely becomes clear. This is one of the modern mind's quieter losses. People still have moments without speech, but they rarely have moments without input. The mouth may be silent while the inner world remains crowded. The hands are still, but the mind is still being fed, still reacting, still receiving, still carrying an invisible stream of fragments from 1 hour into the next. And when that becomes normal, a person can begin to feel that the problem is simply life itself, when, in truth, part of the problem is that the mind has not had a chance to settle enough to hear itself cleanly. Silence is not emptiness in this sense. It is repair. It is the atmosphere in which mental residue begins to fall. The emotional dust of the day starts to settle. What mattered and what merely agitated you no longer look the same. The urgent loses some of its spell. The noisy loses some of its power. And little by little, the mind regains a quality that constant input slowly strips away. Depth. This is why so many people feel strange the moment silence appears. They do not feel rested by it. They feel confronted by it. Their own thoughts become louder, their restlessness more obvious, their need for stimulation harder to hide. But this discomfort is not proof that silence is wrong for them. It is often proof that silence is revealing how dependent the mind has become on interruption. A person who cannot bear a little stillness is not merely bored. Very often they have lost contact with inward steadiness. The Stoics understood the value of withdrawal in this deeper sense, not permanent withdrawal from human life, but deliberate return to oneself. Seneca wrote of gathering oneself rather than being poured out everywhere. That image matters because it reminds you that attention leaks, it disperses, it gets drawn outward in small amounts until the self begins to feel thin. Silence is one of the ways a person gathers back what has been leaking away. And this gathering is not passive. It changes what becomes possible afterward. Work becomes cleaner. Thought becomes less reactive. Emotion becomes less contagious. Even refusal becomes easier, because the mind is no longer so hungry for interruption. Silence resets more than energy. It resets proportion. It helps you see what belongs at the center and what was only making noise at the edges. But if silence is recovery, then the next truth is harder, because recovery alone is not enough. A person may understand attention, protect it better, and even restore it in quiet. Yet real focus will still demand something costly. Which is why the 14th rule matters. Accept that focus requires sacrifice. This is where many people secretly resist the deepest level of the whole subject. They want the fruits of focus without paying the social, emotional, and psychological price it asks. They want clarity without saying no to anything. They want depth without giving up stimulation. They want progress without disappointing impulse. They want serious attention while remaining endlessly available to novelty, comfort, entertainment, and approval. But attention does not become powerful by accident. It becomes powerful by exclusion. Every meaningful loyalty creates a refusal somewhere else. That is true in love. It is true in character. It is true in work. And it is true in attention. If something truly matters, other things must matter less. There is no way around this. Focus is not a mood. It is a structure of chosen loss. You give up immediacy for importance. You give up impulse for direction. You give up scattered pleasures for a steadier form of power. And yes, sometimes you give up being fully understood by people who confuse constant availability with warmth, or who experience your boundaries as distance. That is why this rule feels severe, because it touches the place where many people still want to be rescued from consequence. They want someone to tell them that with the right method, they can stay deeply focused, without missing anything, without offending anyone, without feeling deprived, and without closing any doors. But that is a child's fantasy, not a serious philosophy of life. To attend to one thing properly is to stop attending to many others. To remain faithful to what deserves your mind is to let other invitations go unanswered. And this is not a punishment, it is maturity. The person who refuses sacrifice remains available to everything, and because they remain available to everything, they are eventually claimed by anything. A life like that may look open, flexible, responsive, but inwardly it becomes weak because it is never willing to lose the lesser in order to protect the greater. So the question becomes more honest now. What are you still unwilling to lose? What comforts, distractions, habits, little emotional rewards or forms of availability still have too much permission in your life? Where do you still want concentration without renunciation? Because wherever that contradiction remains, focus will remain partial. Not because you are incapable of depth, but because part of you is still bargaining against it. And when that bargain is finally seen more clearly, the last truth of the episode begins to take shape. Not as a technique now, and not even as a discipline in the narrow sense, but as a recognition that runs underneath all the others. The 15th rule is to remember that your attention becomes your life. This is the point at which the whole subject stops being about productivity, efficiency, or personal optimization and becomes something much more serious. Attention is not just a tool you use. It is one of the main ways you become who you are. What you repeatedly attend to enters your character. What you repeatedly return to builds the architecture of your days. And your days, quietly and without asking permission, become your life. This is why so much depends on attention, not because the modern world praises focus, but because repeated attention is a form of devotion. Whatever receives it consistently begins shaping your habits, your nervous system, your desires, your standards, even your sense of what reality is. If your attention is always claimed by noise, you become noisier inwardly. If it is always claimed by comparison, you become more unstable. If it is always claimed by what is trivial but stimulating, your life slowly takes on that same texture. Not dramatically, gradually, daily, through repetition. And the opposite is also true. If your attention keeps returning to what matters, even imperfectly, something in you is formed by that loyalty. Character deepens, thought becomes less scattered. Your relationship with time changes. What once felt unbearable to remain with becomes more inhabitable. What once stole you so easily begins losing some of its command. The mind becomes less cheap, less available to every passing thing, more capable of depth, of steadiness, of serious presence. Marcus Aurelius was right to return again and again to the governance of the inner life, because that is where destiny often hides in plain sight, not in grand declarations, but in the repeated management of attention. In what you keep letting in what you keep strengthening, in what you keep returning to when no one is watching. A life is not only shaped by major decisions, it is shaped by recurring permissions. So, in the end, focus is not merely about getting more done, it is about refusing to let the unworthy organize your existence. It is about becoming someone whose inner life is not so easily recruited by triviality, emotion, noise, novelty, urgency, comparison, or drift. Someone who can choose what matters, return when they slip, remain through the dull stretch before depth begins, and accept the cost of not belonging to everything. Because your attention will belong to something, it will serve something. The only real question is whether that something is worthy of your life. And if this episode stays with you, let it stay in a practical way, not as a passing feeling, but as a daily standard. Guard what enters. Doubt what shouts, refuse what drains, return when you drift, choose what deserves your mind, and let the rest remain outside. Over time, that quiet discipline becomes more than focus. It becomes a different way of living,